folks. Welcome back. In today's lesson, we will be looking at a couple of very important concepts in Canadian law. The first we'll be looking at is the question of the death penalty, and in particular, we'll be looking at how it used to be used in Canada. It was actually quite a regular part of sentencing up until the 1960s. And then we'll also talk a little bit about why it was removed from sentencing options beginning in 1976, and what some of the pros and cons of that particular decision have been. In your second day, and I'll only just briefly introduce it with this presentation, but you'll follow up on some of the work you're going to do. We'll talk a little bit about the question of what happens when a person is wrongfully convicted of a crime. And we'll consider that question in relation to the first lesson, wherein we'll ask the question, well, if a person has been sentenced to death and it's later found out that they didn't commit that crime, is that an error in justice that can ever be recovered from? What are the consequences of that particular decision? To start off with, I just wanted to review some of the details from your lessons last week, because of course today's lesson will connect with them in certain ways. Last class and the class before that, we talked a little bit about the idea of sentencing reform. And essentially what we said is this. In Canada, for years, there had been very common sentencing goals, and you can see those on the list there: to deter, to punish, to protect, to rehabilitate. Core ideas that have been discussed for years in various kinds of classes. Obviously, those are important goals, but in the 90s, as the number of people in jail started to build up and questions started to emerge in terms of, are we really providing solutions to the crimes that occurs that are sufficient for the current modern needs of Canada? New ideas were added to that list. And in particular, two that were added to the picture are as follows. One of them, which we mentioned, involves the need for justice for victims. And that doesn't just mean justice in the sense that somebody has been punished and put away, but also the idea that a victim and community should have some role to play in terms of sentencing and having a voice in deciding what should occur. And then also the notion that not just should victims have a voice, but that even perhaps offenders themselves should have some role to play in terms of determining the outcome of their sentencing. And that perhaps bringing victims, the community, the offender together, it can be an effective collective strategy used to restore social balance. And of course, that's an important objective. You'll notice that when you look at that list, a lot of the more recent reform efforts have focused on the idea of rehabilitation and providing support to various people, the offender, the victim, so on and so forth. That's important, but it doesn't necessarily conform to all people's notions of justice. And certainly another option for sentencing, which really doesn't get discussed, and some people within Canada argue should be on that list, comes from the completely opposite perspective, and it looks at the need for not just retribution, but perhaps actually taking a person who's committed a crime and not just putting them away or punishing them, but perhaps actually punishing them to the extent that they're removed from society and are, killed themselves. We call that capital punishment or the death penalty. It's something we once had in Canada, but we don't have anymore. And there's still a lot of debate, of course. Was that the right move? Is that an option that should have been taken off the table? And so today we're going to explore a little bit, well, what happened to the death penalty? Why did it disappear? And why is it that some people, even to this day, feel like that was a mistake making that particular choice? Couple questions to consider, and you're going to consider these in your homework as well. So please consider them as we go through the lesson. First question that has a couple of parts is, should Canada use the death penalty? What might be the arguments that a person could make in favor of using that sentence? What are some of the reasons why it's still used and advocated on behalf of by many people and in many countries around the world? Second, it's sort of the opposite point, but of course it needs to be considered, is, okay, well, why might we not want to have the death penalty? And then a final issue, which will connect in with some of the things you're going to start to do on Monday of next week, is what happens when justice makes a mistake? And how should that notion of wrongful convictions and their potential factor into any conversation about whether or not the death penalty is appropriate? We're going to go through a little bit of the history of the death penalty, so bear with me, but I did want to give you a little bit of background on just what the death penalty used to look like in Canada, and then why ultimately over time, especially within the last 50 years, it very quickly disappeared. For most of Canada's early history, and we're talking about not just Canada as a country, but actually Canada in terms of its earlier colonial incarnations in the 1700s, 1800s. For most of those years up until 1967, death was very commonly used as a penalty, and was seen as an appropriate option for sentencing. And in fact, that was consistent with most of the modern world at that time. Estimates suggest that from 1759 to 1967, and you can see this on your screen here, there were over 1,400 people in Canada who were sentenced to death, and at least 710 of those execution orders actually went through. You'll notice that that's about half of the people who had that particular penalty actually had it happen in terms of being executed. Kind of a terrible word to use there, but you get the idea. The reason for that is that in a country like Canada, we've always had a lot of checks and balances, even in periods where the death penalty was used a little bit more regularly. And in most of those cases, the half where it was actually removed, there would have been appeals, and that would have been the result of various sort of pleas to not use that penalty and perhaps having sentences reduced. You'll also notice that the vast majority were men. Of all of those 1,400 people, only 13 were ever women. Two reasons stand out for that. One of them is the fact that just in a general sense, crime, and in particular violent crimes, which usually lead to the death penalty, are much lower in terms of their percentages for women to have been the, I guess, key perpetrator than for men. And so naturally, you're going to have lower numbers there. The other reason is that even in the case of violent crime, and it's somewhat ironic, there is often a belief that women were more perhaps capable of rehabilitation, sort of the old-fashioned notion of women as the softer sex. And certainly in the period up and until the 1950s, the discrimination that actually held women back in many respects, ironically also was a bit of a shield when it came to the death penalty, because the belief was that if a woman had committed a crime, unless it was a truly egregious act, there was a little bit more of an opportunity, as I mentioned, to rehabilitate, and that it would be abhorrent if you actually put that particular person to death. So kind of an interesting point there. When you look at the years before 1967, there are a number of sort of phases for how the death penalty existed within our country. In the years up and until 1867, so before Confederation and the establishment of Canada properly, primarily under French and then eventually British rule, we did have sort of a piecemeal history for the death penalty. We don't have exact records because, of course, some of them have disappeared over the years. Sometimes they've been lost to fire. Sometimes they just sort of have been lost to, I guess, just poor record keeping over time. We do know, however, that it was regularly applied, and especially from the 1750s through to the 1860s, where records are a little bit more available. We know that it was applied under essentially the terms of common British law, which was the system that was used throughout the colonies. Up and until 1859, that was a law set that involved a lot of potential for the use of the death penalty, at least in theory. There are actually, you might find this hard to believe, but it fits with that sort of period and the mindset that existed. There were over 230 crimes under British common law that could be punishable by death. Some of them include the obvious, like murder, and the vast majority of actual Canadian cases would have involved that. But you also, at least according to the rules of the day, could apply a death penalty to much lower crimes, some that you might even consider petty just in terms of being a criminal act, like stealing of food or disguising oneself in the forest. I guess it's sort of an invisible threat of sorts in the community. Are there a lot of examples of those kinds of crimes leading to death penalty in early Canadian history? No. But that being said, it was at least in theory possible until 1859. It shows you how different society was during those years. When Canada started to become more of a nation, so with the formation of the Dominion of Canada and Confederation of the first four provinces in 1867, there was a move towards making the death penalty a little bit more exclusive and a little bit less connected to the will of the public and more connected to the rule of law. Part of that involved simplifying and limiting the legal, I guess, options for where the death penalty could be used. And essentially, there were three crimes from 1867 onwards where you could apply it. Murder, which remained the most common, rape, and in violent versions of rape, that was quite a common penalty for some of those years. And then finally, not as common, but technically possible, treason. If you don't know what treason is, treason involves doing something in terms of diplomacy that goes against the best interests of the state. So if you're spying or something like that, in theory, you could be given the death penalty in Canada for that crime. I don't know if it ever happened. I'd have to look that up. I should know. I'm not sure. But obviously the other two did. The other thing that happened in the 1860s, and it shows again how there's a little bit more of a formality introduced into the approach and a push against just sort of the mob deciding on death as the penalty. They actually closed the gallows and other I guess areas where execution occurred. It was almost always by hanging. So typically the gallows, they closed those to the public. And the reason for that was that they wanted to make sure that justice was being served, but that the public was maybe removed from the spectacle, which is a very negative spectacle of actually seeing a person killed for the crime that they committed. They would have maintained gallows in many other parts of the Western world for years after that. So, for example, in some parts of the United States, especially in the South, gallows were quite a common feature within societies. But in Canada, we obviously decided to move to a little bit more of a private approach for that particular application of penalty. Now, that didn't always stop people from actually viewing the death penalty in action, and you can see a little bit of an indication of that in this picture. This is a really famous picture. It was taken in about 1901, 1902 in Quebec. And you can see here that the gallows, while they were technically within the, I guess, grounds of the prison, they were outdoors in a yard. And I think they were well aware of the fact this was happening. A lot of people within the neighborhood would actually get up on the taller buildings and try to watch. And you can see them climbing to the rooftop there, tried to watch the execution. The people who ran the justice system were law obliging. They followed the technical rules of the law, but in having the gallows out in public in many locations and knowing that the public was watching, I think there was also a sense that they believed in that element of community justice that had been banned officially, but that had always been sort of a part of many cultures. When you're looking at the period of early Canadian history, and really all the way up and until about World War II, certainly until World War I, I think the simplest thing you can say about the death penalty is that not only was it used, but it was pretty, not universally, but pretty regularly accepted by most people. Were there pockets of opposition? Sure. And I've noted one of these on your screen here. There was a Liberal MP in World War I. His name was Robert Bickerdike. And he felt for religious and moral reasons that taking a life as retribution for another life taken solved nothing and was wrong on moral grounds. He tried to get it repealed. He made an effort within the House of Commons, but it really didn't go very far. And in fact, most efforts like that, they had very little, I guess, political weight behind them. The vast majority of people up and until World War II in the public and within the government supported the idea of the death penalty. And even in periods where you had those small pockets of effort to remove it, like the Bickerdike effort in World War I, it was actually still quite regularly being used by many other people within the government and other aspects of, I guess, Canadian society. Just kind of an interesting point here. During World War I, Canada actually had 25 people who were sent to death, not because they committed a crime within the context of Canadian criminal law, but also because, rather because of the fact that they had committed military crimes. I didn't mention this before, but the military had always also had its own courts, and they had the ability to apply the death penalty. And according to the terms of military law, and it would have been more British than Canadian law, but we fought underneath the British, there was the opportunity for the military to actually sentence a person to death in World War I for desertion or cowardice. And while two of the people who were sentenced to death were sentenced for murder, they killed somebody outside of battle and it was considered to be wrong. 23 of those people were actually executed because they left the front lines during World War I. We were actually a lot harsher as a country in Canada during those years than even countries today we would consider to be a little bit harsher, like the United States. In the years since the American Civil War, and this is an example of American Civil War execution for desertion. American Civil War, by the way, was in the 1860s, if you don't know that. There's actually only been one example in history, and it happened in World War II, of the Americans executing a deserter for that particular military offense. Whereas in Canada, just during World War I alone, you saw 23 people were murdered for that particular reason. I shouldn't say murdered, but were given state penalty. That would be the official term. When you consider how horrific World War I was, I think you can get a sense of just how different people's perspective was at the time in terms of things like using the death penalty than it would be today. The idea today that a person who had been brought into the war effort would run away from that kind of carnage that you can see. And World War I was the worst war probably in human history. I think today actually a lot of people, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people would be fairly sympathetic to a soldier in those particular moments. Certainly at the time, though, it would have been considered to be a major crime, and obviously the penalty is reflective of that. Interesting how 100 years can change our perspective so much. In the years after 1945, you did start to see a major shift in terms of people's views and values. And that eventually led to the pressures, which within the next 20 years led to the end of the death penalty in Canada. Part of the reason why that occurred was that after World War II, I think more and more people in our society started to think a little bit more carefully about things like human rights and the rights that individuals had. And many people started to believe that taking a life as a consequence for a crime was not necessarily an ideal form of justice. One of the other things that started to happen was that you had a lot of young people. A lot of young people in a period of growing change and growing liberalism started to push for new ways of dealing with criminal law. And that led to a lot of pressure by the 1960s as those young people from the baby boom started to become adults to actually change the laws in a more significant way. The beginning of that shift, and it happened really quickly. The 60s is an era where a lot of things happened very quickly. Happened in 1961. 1961, they eliminated the ability to use capital punishment for anything other than what they called capital murder, which is essentially a first-degree murder by today's terminology. Unless you premeditated murder or you murdered a police officer or a peace officer. Peace officer is like a person at the border, so on and so forth, not quite police, but has the same sort of legal status. Or similar legal status, you could not actually receive a death penalty. And with those laws in place, even then, it was very rarely being used in the 60s. Reducing the number of crimes that qualified was one step, but it didn't really satisfy everybody. And in fact, by 1967, it became very certain that no court was ever going to apply that penalty. They more or less had an informal agreement from 67 onwards, according to the government of the day, which was still Lester Pearson, that it wouldn't get used. And then in 1976, by the time that Pierre Trudeau had become not just justice minister, but prime minister, they had a formal vote in the House of Commons, and it was formally abolished. But it was always understood in the 9 years before that it wouldn't get used. It hadn't actually been used in Canada until or since 1962. Now, one final side point I should mention about its abolition. The formal abolition occurs for domestic law in 1976, but I mentioned that there was also the ability for the military through its own court system, because it's got a separate court system, to use the death penalty. The National Defense Act, which deals with military courts, it actually technically had capital punishment as a sentencing option for things like treason up until 1998. But I think everybody understood more or less through all of that period from the 60s onwards that even within the military, the notion of having a death penalty being used for a military crime in the 80s or the 90s, that would have been seen as absolutely against the views and values of the military. Nobody was ever really planning on using it. It was just a dead law until it was finally gotten rid of in that later date. This is a picture here which you can see of the last two people who were executed in Canada. You'll notice that these two individuals were actually killed in Toronto. You can look up the story if you want a little bit more detail, but in simple terms, they'd come up from Detroit. They'd been involved in robbery and the murder of a police officer, I believe. And as a consequence for those very heinous crimes, especially given that it was a police officer involved, and that was always seen as a higher level of murder, they were given the death penalty. The picture here, you'll probably remember it. It actually was taken from the slide that you saw earlier. That's a false picture. It's not actually the Don Jail. The Don Jail in Toronto, which you can still visit if you ever get a chance. It's in sort of the east part of the downtown, just over the Don River. If you go on like Open Doors, I think they still open up to the public. They actually had a gallows that was much more private, and it was within the facility. Now today they've taken it out because of course they haven't executed anybody since the 60s, but they still have the room, and it's actually kind of an interesting, if you ever get a chance to go in there, it's actually kind of an interesting relic of an earlier era. All right, so the death penalty was, I guess, removed in 1976 formally. Have we ever debated in a serious way bringing it back? Well, the truth to that particular story is that yes, once, although there was never really any major likelihood that it would be brought back. In 1976, there were some people within the government who'd been upset about the vote that ended the death penalty. And part of the reason why was that the Liberal government had a majority, and so if they wanted their members to vote a certain way, would always know that a vote would go through. When they had the vote, they declared it to be a vote which required all of the House to vote in a certain fashion. They didn't make it a free conscience vote, but they made it one which was whipped, which means that every Liberal had to vote to support it, I believe. Some people had felt like that was, I guess, against their wishes. They felt like some Liberals had been pressured to vote for abolition that maybe actually supported it. And for years, especially among the opposition Conservatives, there had been an argument that things like the death penalty are a conscience concept that should be open to a free vote and not one that's whipped by the sort of party whip within the caucus. And so when the Brian Mulroney government came in 1984, if you don't know very much about history, they defeated Pierre Trudeau's successor, John Turner, quite handily in 1984. They had a huge majority. They decided to have at least the option for a vote. Mulroney himself didn't want to reinstate the death penalty. He was very opposed to it, but he at least wanted to give his members the ability to have a voice. And so what he decided to do was he allowed for a member within his government to present what's called a private member's bill. The private member's bill meant that it was just the view of the individual MP, and that should say MP, not MPP, because it's federal government. In that particular instance, they were already aware that the Conservatives, a number, were going to vote against the death penalty. Most of the other parties were going to vote against it, and the vote would lose. And so Mulroney probably figured, well, fine, go ahead with it. I don't have to risk any political capital here, at least not a lot, because it's not going to be reinstated. I won't have to deal with the consequences there. And so he essentially said, everybody vote the way you want to. And when the vote occurred, predictably, despite the government having a majority, so if they wanted to, they could have passed the bill by making people vote for it. They let people have a decision that was their own, and it ultimately was defeated 147 to 128. That was the last time, and you'll see that Mulroney and a lot of Conservatives voted against. That's why, despite having a majority, it actually failed. That was the last time in Canada where we had a vote in the House of Commons, and really since that point the matter has been more or less on ice. And there you can see a picture from CPAC of the actual vote, and it was kind of a dramatic thing, even though I think everybody knew in the end the results that were going to come. Today, what's the picture like in terms of the death penalty? Well, a couple of points. First and foremost, there's lots of people within the public who have wanted to see it come back. But unfortunately for those people, at least from their perspective, they don't seem to have a lot of political momentum on their side. When they do studies and they do polls, they often find the issue, it oscillates a little bit, but about 50-50. Yes, we should have it. No, we shouldn't, within the general public. But most political parties, I think just because they know it would be difficult to do, don't really want to get involved with that particular issue in terms of legislation. And so there's really no major party in the government currently, or has been since the 80s, that's even really talked very much and certainly tried to bring the death penalty back. Part of the reason for that is also the fact that the legal picture has become more complicated in Canada. As you're well aware at this point in the course, in 1982, we introduced the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That made things constitutionally challenging because essentially it introduced provisions that would make the death penalty perhaps inconsistent with their main sort of thrust or content. The two that stand out would be the provision in Section 12 against having cruel and unusual punishments, and also the Section 7 guarantee that everybody in Canada has a right to life, liberty, and security of the person. It's not to say you couldn't get a Supreme Court of Canada to rule that the death penalty doesn't violate those things. There's always the potential for a reasonable limits argument, but given the way the Supreme Court has generally leaned over the years and the sort of nature of the different views they tend to hold on in terms of their decisions, it seems highly unlikely that any legislative effort would ever hold up to a constitutional challenge. And I think that in of itself is enough momentum to really make most parties not want to bother. It's probably not worth the effort of introducing a law and then having to fight with the courts, which you don't really have the constitutional ability to do anyways. When you compare Canada and the United States, and we're going to look at this a little bit in the last part of the lesson here, as well as other countries, certainly we are a little bit different because while we don't have a death penalty, and we don't look like we're close to bringing it back anytime soon. There's lots of parts of the world where it's used, and there's lots of parts of the world where it's actually considered to be fairly regular and necessary. In the United States, you can look a little bit at the picture here, and I've put a couple of graphs just to kind of clarify their status in terms of how it's used. One point that I should make was that in the early 1970s, they had a Supreme Court decision, like we talked about potentially in Canada, where they'd actually overturned all death penalties. They said they were unconstitutional. That's the reason why people like Charles Manson and other major criminals from that period never were sent to death, because the death penalty essentially became unconstitutional for a period of time. In 1976, there was a new Supreme Court decision which actually overturned the original precedent. And I'm sorry, I forget the name of the case, but you can look it up. That opened the door in 1976 to a reinstatement of the death penalty in states that chose to do so. But not every state necessarily did. And knowing that criminal law is a state matter in the United States versus a national matter, different states chose to reintroduce in different ways than whereas others, the ones that you can see in the light blue here, ultimately never did. Even when you consider states that have it, it's not equally applied. Some states have much more careful, I guess, checks and balances, wherein it may actually be very hard to actually execute the order for death that's been given, and a lot of people may just end up on I guess, death row for most of their lives. They may not actually really face execution because it's just so difficult to go through with. Whereas other parts of the United States, the appeals are not so available to an individual. And in fact, the death penalty is not only offered as a sentence or given as a sentence, but in fact, it's more regularly used. Here you can see an example of that, and the next graph will be a little bit better. I apologize, I couldn't get stats that were for 2016 to 2020, but I got a lot that went up until fairly recently. Texas, again, you can see is by far the most. It's the most, I guess, willing to use the death penalty and open in terms of its laws for doing so. A few other states that stand out would be Oklahoma, Missouri, and these are not nearly as large states, so it's actually a pretty large number when you consider the per capita issues, Virginia, and then Ohio. There's some other states, and I guess to a certain extent Florida. There's some other states like California where it's been used a lot as a penalty, but again, because of the checks and balances that are involved, and you can see that here, while they've had over 700, closing in on 800 execution orders, there have been those sentences given by various states throughout the courts throughout the state. They've actually only had less than 20 people who have ever actually had death as their final penalty. And that's one of the arguments sometimes people make about the death penalty, is the fact that it's not always an efficient penalty. And in fact, when you factor in all of the costs of those appeals and all the lawyers for the state that fight against the appeals, when you're talking 20, 30 years worth of legal battles, it adds up very quickly. And some would argue that it's just not an efficient penalty in a state like that. We're going to look at a case on extradition when we look at international law, which deals with a man whose name was Charles Ng. He fled to Canada, and then he was eventually sent back to face the death penalty. We'll get into why later. He was a pretty notorious serial killer, so there was no real debate about the fact he needed a significant penalty. He was given the death penalty. That was debated. But what's interesting is that he was given that penalty in, I believe, about 1987 or so, and he's still there waiting for his execution. It's looking like he may never actually get executed. And if that's the case, some would argue, well, what's the point of all of that? Okay, and certainly that's an interesting sort of thing to consider if you're arguing for or against the death penalty being there. Last couple of points I'll make for just the first day's lesson here is that when you look at the death penalty around the world, again, some countries tend to use it more than others. The countries that are in light green are the countries that definitely don't use it. And you'll notice most of the British Commonwealth, at least in terms of countries like Canada, New Zealand, Australia, some of the wealthier countries don't use it. Almost all of Europe, the only exception really within Europe is this one country here, which I had to look up, but it's Belarus. Belarus is a really backwards country. It actually has far less liberties than almost any other part of Europe. Those countries, other than Belarus, don't have it. Whereas if you look at the countries that are in the darker red, they definitely do. And some of those countries use it far more than others. You may or may not know, but the country that uses it by far the most, and you can see this in the darker picture, it hasn't changed since 2016, is China. How often does China use the death penalty? Well, we know that they use it thousands of times every year, which is way, way higher than any other part of the world. Unfortunately, while China is a meticulous country in terms of its record keeping, it probably has better records than almost anywhere in the world. They don't ever share those records, the People's Republic, with other countries, at least rarely do they. And so we really just don't know. One of the reasons why you get such a criticism of China by Amnesty International is the fact that there's a lot of secretive sort of hiding of numbers and also manipulation of data. It's a little bit of a political comment, but I'll make it anyways. When you look at China and you look at statistics, always, as a general rule, take those statistics that are offered by that People's Republic with a grain of salt, because there's a lot of reason and a lot of tendency within that country to manipulate those numbers for political reasons. The other country that's way up on the list would be Iran. Again, another country that they've officially stated 977. Whether or not that's perfectly accurate, we're not sure, but a country that doesn't always believe in human rights the way that most countries would. And then Pakistan and Saudi Arabia would be high up on your list as well. Every other country is much, much lower in terms of the number of people on average per year who would be executed. Okay. Your work for day one is as follows. You've heard a little bit about the background to the death penalty, a little bit about why it was there, why it was removed, and how it sort of is applied to different areas in the world today. What I want you to do is very straightforward, but listen carefully. First thing is I want you to do a little bit of research, and you can really look up anywhere, but hopefully a couple of sites, just do a quick search. I want you to look up a little bit on the death penalty and sort of how it's used around the world. Then, referencing your research, I want you to make a list, and this is just for your own notes, but do it, of 7 reasons why it might be something that people would want, 7 reasons why it would be maybe not such an ideal idea. I guess, part of a system. The second thing that I want you to do, and I do want you to submit this to me, and you can do it in one of 2 ways, is I want you to think about the question, do you think Canada should have the death penalty in 2020 based on all the things you've seen and heard? For that, and it's going to be a formative checkup, but I have to keep a record that you're doing work so you can submit it to me. I want you either to give me a page, okay, just a quick page, but please make it hopefully at least like a paragraph. Or if you want, and I'll try something a little bit different here, if you want to record yourself in a video just sharing your views and reflecting on what you've been thinking about with your readings, you can send that to me as well. Okay, and I'll check that. Try to get that to me before the end of the week, just as sort of a confirmation that, yes, I've been doing the work and here it is. Okay, so that's your work for Thursday, March 26th. At this particular point, you can stop and work on that. I'm going to continue with the video and discuss a little bit of an introduction to the lesson on the 30th, but for now, you can pause and just sort of wait and move on. Okay. Thank you, folks, for working through on the lesson for the 26th. Today, I'm going to give you just a very quick introduction to the lesson you're going to do on the 30th. And this is a lesson that deals with a very important concept in terms of what happens when the justice system fails people for a particular reason. Question I have for you, and it would work better if you're in a live setting, but I'll ask it just, I guess, to you while you're watching. What do all the people in the picture there have in common? They're all Canadian citizens. They all have something in common. Can you guess what that thing is? Well, if you guess that they're all people who've been wrongfully convicted, and you might have just based on some of the information I've already given to you, you would be correct. They're all people who at some point in time were convicted of a crime, oftentimes murder, and ultimately we determined through new information and new sort of evidence that was revealed that the conviction was not actually a fair one and that the person never should have been brought to justice. In fact, they never should have been declared guilty in a criminal court. As you'll see, we don't have a perfect system. Canada's system is, I think, by most people's accounts, better than most parts of the world. We have a good justice system, but no justice system is perfect, and sometimes, unfortunately, mistakes do get made. When you have a mistake where you have a wrongful conviction, it's a terrible, terrible mistake, one of the worst that can happen within your system, because it results in not just one failure of justice, but actually 2. There's a double failure of justice that occurs there. The first is the most obvious. The innocent individual is wronged, but you also have a second failure of justice in the sense that the guilty person, because they weren't actually prosecuted and brought to justice, they get to go free. And in fact, if the wrongful conviction holds for long enough, you may never even have the resources or the ability to actually properly research and get a do-over and find that person who should have actually faced some kind of penalty for their actions. When you have the death penalty, you can imagine it becomes even more significant as a potential area of justice, because not only will you have a person who will have been put in jail for something they didn't do, but they don't really have any opportunity to be given some kind of repayment or apology, because of course they're not there yet, or still to have that sort of opportunity in the future. What I want you to do for today is I want you to look at an example of a famous case where we've had a wrongful conviction. You'll notice on this slide, and you can look it over a little bit, maybe pause and take a quick look. There have been a number of really famous scenarios where people have been wrongly convicted in Canada, and these are just some of the ones that stand out. For your study, I want you to look at the story of one of them, and that's the story of Stephen Truscott. Today, you're going to look at a video, and the video will talk a little bit about how, as a young boy in 1959, he was convicted of murder of a young girl, spent many years in jail, spent many years after he got out, because don't forget he was a young offender, so he didn't spend his whole life in jail, until 2008. So almost 50 years later, it was finally determined that the actual conviction should not have occurred, and an official apology was given. It's an interesting story. It's certainly a story that I think you're going to find one that really makes you think very carefully about just notions of justice and how we should deal with things when obviously mistakes are made. I won't say too much more about that, because you're going to see most of the details in the film you watch. I'll post a little bit of a summary where I'll talk about the case later, probably early next week, where you can compare that to your answers. But for today, all I want you to do is I just want you to watch that, and I want you to take notes using the question sheet that's provided. So good luck. And as I said with your last lesson, if there's any questions that you have either about the Thursday work or about the work for today, the 30th of March, then please let me know. I'm happy to answer as quickly as I can. Good luck.